AI art has been ruffling a lot of feathers as of late. A video from late 2022 called Dark Souls as an 80s dark fantasy film has started a trend of giving this treatment to other franchises, from Star Wars to The Office. I think it is no coincidence that this trend exploded at the beginning of 2023, funnily coinciding with the abysmal failure of The Witcher: Blood Origin. We must face an uncomfortable truth, and that is that artificial intelligence is unironically better at creating fantasy than Hollywood and Netflix are. People are so starved for some genuine fantasy that they would rather look at some randomly generated AI pictures than watch the billion, and that's with a B, billion-dollar fanfiction Rings of Power.
1 billion.
A common criticism of AI art is that it possesses no artistic merit. That is true. Any artistry that it does have is merely the residue of other works. But if that is the case, what does that say about us? What does it say about our culture when a randomized amalgamation of scraps of past art is actually more beautiful and intriguing than something that people are putting vast amounts of time and resources into? And I know that that is a very harsh thing to say. I know there are some aspects of those shows where the aesthetics do shine, and there clearly was good effort put into those parts. But nevertheless, it is still a very damning condemnation of our culture that people will most likely prefer these uncanny valley creations over professional productions. There is something missing that money alone cannot buy. There is something that the shows lack that the AI images have. The AI generations actually feel like a fantasy realm. They have an otherworldly quality. The uncanny valley effect might actually be a positive in some respect, as they don't just look like a bunch of Californians, which I guess I will coin here as the uncanny Silicon Valley effect. The use of the 80s is also quite interesting. It is quite a popular trend today, if you are of the critical drinker variety, to believe that our entertainment is basically crap today, yet was amazing in the 80s. While there may be some truth to that, and maybe even a lot of truth to that, I must say that this narrative is a bit exhausting, and the sheer amount of 80s nostalgia, I do believe, is holding us back somewhat. It is notable that the 80s was the last truly internet-free decade. The irony is that people are longing for times before the internet while simultaneously using the internet itself as the veritable fountain of youth in which to live out their nostalgic fantasies. 80s nostalgia is deeply entrenched in our culture. It is so entrenched that it has lost all its meaning. People wonder why the Zoomers have such a strange sense of humor. But I think this is partially because they grew up watching Family Guy, which is full of 80s references that they do not understand. With no tangible context, they think that the comedy is in the randomness.
80s nostalgia isn't funny anymore. It's tired and worn out.
If I had to rename the Zoomers, I would call them Generation Random, as they might as well be randomly generated, much like the AI art. I think one visit to TikTok will demonstrate this sense of people being randomly generated. This loss of being grounded is why I think people long for the 80s, back when things seemed a bit more uniform and less sporadic and nonsensical. But there is another layer, of course. Fantasy. 80s dark fantasy is very specific. I myself quite enjoy Labyrinth and The Princess Bride, but I wouldn't exactly call either of those films dark. And the dark fantasy films that I have seen were from much later, in the early 2000s. Yet, I still recognize the 80s dark fantasy aesthetic, even though I perhaps have never seen a single 80s dark fantasy movie. Perhaps this is a liminal reality type thing. I have seen 80s fantasy, and I've seen dark fantasy, so seeing the two combined, especially when it's of a character I've seen in a video game or something along those lines, it then creates a surreal, dreamlike effect. It is familiar, but also alien. The uncanny valley effect, then, is just liminality. Liminality is the in-between, the zone in the middle. For us, in our lives, liminality is the ambiguity or disorientation that occurs during a rite of passage or transition. For a more literal example, think of the tadpole who has grown small legs. It is not yet a frog. It is in a liminal space. I think this is where our culture is at. We can no longer swim in the waters of the 80s, but we can't live outside those waters just yet. Perhaps we are at the threshold of something huge. We are becoming more mythological, hence this medieval aesthetic. We will rediscover some long-lost magic and embrace this liminality. Though it may be frightening, beauty and adventure awaits us. Our acculturation continues as we ask ourselves, what's in a meme?